the scale of this transfer is so big that the implications of it for the European game, certainly at the very top of the game, would be enormous. Domestic leagues deal with domestic issues. So that's the default position, and is likely to be the default position here. So all of the Article 17 arguments about how he can rip up his contract and pay over a very low compensation fee and then happily go on his way to Liverpool is misplaced. A lot of noise, but I would question whether anything meaningful has changed overnight. Well, I think you need to look first of all at what Isak says. So he seems to be hinting that the wrong narrative has been put out over the last few weeks, when in reality the messages that he's got out via friendly faces in the media has been very much as he said in the article, so in his statement. So I actually don't think from Isak's perspective he's told us anything that we didn't already know. I think everybody was aware that he considers that he was made some promises in the last year or so that have not been fulfilled. I think that's been well briefed out and about, so I don't think it was a particular surprise. I think Newcastle's response, likewise, is more or less what they've said publicly through their sort of preferred media outlets, which is in the circumstances that they managed to get a replacement in, and Liverpool managed to hit their price, then reluctantly they would be prepared to let the player go. In the absence of that, Newcastle's position appears to be that the player won't go. Now, that said, of course, when you see it in writing, it sort of hits a bit differently. And I think, therefore, it is seen with some justification to be a further escalation from Isak in terms of his ability to stay in Newcastle, and perhaps shows that he has no intention of building bridges and coming back into the team and playing this season at the moment. So a lot of noise, but I would question whether anything meaningful has changed overnight. I don't think it's a case of earlier from his timing, in his perspective. I think it's clear that the conversations have been ongoing for quite some time. I mean, there's good information out there in respect of him having a dispute at the start of last season about his future. I think Newcastle's conditions in terms of finding a replacement have been pretty well flagged throughout the summer. They obviously have tried quite hard to find a replacement. I think maybe you could argue that Liverpool made a tactical error in terms of Ekitike, and by pursuing that player. Had Newcastle been given a clear run on the player, perhaps they would have been more willing to do a deal in respect of Isak. Or the two teams could easily have made an agreement between themselves as to how the negotiations might pan out in those given circumstances. They've chosen not to do that, and I think it leaves Newcastle now, having missed out on a number of those prime targets, in a bit of a corner. We've got maybe 10, 15 days left of the window, and they have limited options. And so from their perspective, you can understand that they've been aware of the issue with Isak, possibly slightly in denial as to how serious he was, possibly also suffering from a vacuum of leadership in the club following the situation with both the CEO and the director of football. And that's left them in a situation where we get to this stage of the window and you still have this dispute. Newcastle still don't have even Wissa or a full-on replacement for Isak, and time is running out. And so you can understand why the situation is sort of fraught from both sides, and you can understand some of the justification, I think, in both of the statements, be it Newcastle saying, well, the deal's got to be right for us, and on the other side, the player saying, well, you've made me promises, what's the value anyway of a non-contractual promise? Big question mark there. You failed to fulfill those promises, and I don't see a way back. And so you can sort of see it from both sides still, but this is a huge transaction to be still live in the final days of the window. There's a lot of misinformation about the ability of players to terminate their own contracts. I mean, the first thing to say is that the Premier League has a set contract that deals with disputes between the parties. It deals with the rights and obligations of the parties, and they even publish it in the back of the Premier League rules. So everybody can read it. You just need to go on the Premier League website and download it. And it's very clear in terms of those rights and obligations, and also what happens in the event of a dispute. Now, people point towards Article 17 of the FIFA rules in terms of the transfer rules that are set out by FIFA, and they also point to the recent Diarra case that they say undermines the player contract such that Isak can effectively walk out the door at any time. Now, the key starting point here, of course, is that there is no international element as we sit here today. This is a purely domestic situation. You have a player with a Premier League contract wanting to move from one Premier League club to another Premier League club, and for that registration to be transferred from Newcastle United to Liverpool. Now, ordinarily, the way that works is there is a process whereby the registration is transferred willingly by the selling club to the buying club. Now, clearly, we don't have that situation here. And for Isak to unilaterally terminate his contract, he would put himself squarely into the realms of a dispute with Newcastle United to be governed under the Premier League and or the FA rules. And the FIFA rules in this scenario are unlikely to bite. Now, there is an argument that could be run that because we're talking about a Swedish player in an English league, that there is an element that takes us into the FIFA realm, but there is an explicit clause within the Premier League contract regarding disputes and how disputes need to be dealt with by arbitration under the Premier League rules or the FA rules. So it's going to be very difficult for anybody to argue that the FIFA rules, and by the way, Article 1 of the FIFA rules effectively says that the domestic leagues deal with domestic issues. So that's the default position and is likely to be the default position here. So all of the Article 17 arguments about how he can rip up his contract and pay over a very low compensation fee and then happily go on his way to Liverpool is misplaced. Now, it may be that in the future, let's say next summer, he seeks to invoke a different part of the international transfer rules in a post-Diarra world. And he says 15 days after after the end of next season, he says, I'd like to be a free transfer. He unilaterally breaches his contract and compensation is due under those rules. And he says, I'm going to Barcelona or Real Madrid or Bayern Munich, one of the large European clubs, and they're prepared to take me on. In that scenario, we may well be in a FIFA world and within the FIFA dispute resolution process, and also adjudicated under similar kind of rules to the Diarra case or the Webster case or the other cases that have looked at the compensation. But you need to separate theoretical possibilities from the likely reality here. And the likely reality here, given the stakes being so high, are that, firstly, the player is not going to want to risk a period in limbo, is not going to risk the possibility of tens to £100 million or even more of potential compensation, which obviously would wipe him out financially and bankrupt the player. There is no guarantee that the player is going to be in a position to get an indemnity from a buying club. So the idea that he could just go off to Barcelona or to Real Madrid or to Bayern Munich and have them effectively underwrite, from a legal perspective, any damages that flow from the situation is very unlikely. And then on the club side, you have to remember that the clubs are going to be reluctant to set fire to the entire transfer regime. The clubs of the sort that we're talking about, and this also includes Premier League clubs, but for the sake of this discussion, even the international clubs like Bayern Munich, Barcelona, Real Madrid and PSG, those clubs are sat on very, very valuable player registration rights. They do not want to be party to effectively ripping up the future value of all of player rights. That would be a very dangerous move for them, and it would open the floodgates potentially to lots of issues down the line. So it's likely that you're going to find that the clubs are going to be reluctant to play ball in a situation for a player who is very close to being one of the most expensive players of all time. So I think there's the theoretical, could this happen? Does this give leverage to Isak right now? And then there's the reality. And the reality is probably much simpler. It is that nothing is going to happen between now and the window in terms of clever use of FIFA regulations. He might or might not end up at Liverpool. That is likely to be dependent on whether they can get a player in and whether Liverpool offer enough money. And then you've got a situation that might come up again next summer, but again is much more likely to be a vanilla approach to it, and again is unlikely to have this element of let's set fire to transfer regulations and just see what happens, because the scale of this transfer is so big that the implications of it for the European game, certainly at the very top of the game, would be enormous. And there's a lot of vested interests that will not want to effectively undermine the way the contractual system works. No, I think if the deal happens, let's say in summer of 2026, you still have a situation where the player has 2 years left in his contract. It's still a domestic-only situation, so it's Newcastle to Liverpool. If the player unilaterally walks out of his contract without just cause, and I don't see any basis right now on which he has any cause to terminate his contract, so he would be unilaterally breaching his contract, and under English law, it is likely that the damages that would be payable by the player and or Liverpool would amount to the transfer fee that was sacrificed by Newcastle in that situation. So I see no basis for assuming that the damages would be substantially less than the transfer fee that would be payable. Plus, on top of that, there's all the potential of additional risk in that mix. So it may be that the Premier League arbitration panel or an FA arbitration panel or an appeal board look at the case in a different way to that has been assessed previously on some of the cases that have been at FIFA and at CAS. And by the way, not all of the cases at CAS have looked at it in the way that it was looked at under the Webster case, which is one of the cases that's professed to mean that players can walk out for very low fees. There is a range of assessments that's been made by CAS. Some of them have taken the top end of the potential valuations. And I think in this case, there is good reason to think that the valuation that would be ascribed to Isak and the loss that is ascribed to Newcastle United could be very substantial. An oversimplistic look at it to say, if the player unilaterally breaches his contract, the buying club will therefore get a half-price deal. I don't accept that, and there's no certainty of that. It is possible, but lots of things are possible theoretically, and players and organisations are unlikely to take material risk when it comes to sums of this nature. They're likely to want to follow the more traditional route to a transfer. And ultimately, that is still the most likely outcome in this scenario, be that happening before the end of this window, in January or next summer. That still remains the most likely situation. And we seem to forget that the reality appears to be that the player wants to move to one club right now. There doesn't seem to be a whole queue of teams that he's talking to, or a queue of teams that are interested in the purchase. So this really, right now, is a situation that appears to be about Newcastle, Isak, and Liverpool. That's a wholly domestic situation. It's governed by a Premier League contract, and it is likely, therefore, to be relatively vanilla in that context. I think at various stages during the window, I've probably felt different parties have been in the driving seat or holding the cards. I think you can argue the case on all of the parties in many ways. From the player's perspective, he's unhappy, he's not training, but he's still being paid an enormous amount of money. And there's lots of people that would like to be in a dispute with their employer while still being paid, let's say, £150,000 a week plus various other add-ons. So the player himself is not in a terrible situation, and he has 3 years left on a very lucrative contract, and is suffering a little bit of pain and discomfort from the situation, but it's far from a terrible situation for him. Newcastle are in a tricky position, but again, arguably hold the cards. We have an English law contract, as we've just described, and an English law and the English law protections that go with that. The player has obligations, and the player is not fulfilling his obligations, and therefore, arguably, again, Newcastle are in the driving seat because they control the player's registration. And if I'm right that European clubs and other clubs in the Premier League do not want to set fire to the transfer system, then it is likely that they will end up selling the player for a very substantial fee. So again, arguably, you could say Newcastle still hold the cards. And then you have Liverpool, and Liverpool sit there with, as champions, having added quality to the squad. They are probably not completely dependent upon the signing of Isak. They might like another striker, but it's probable that they could get through the season comfortably without another striker. And in terms of price, I think again, talking on likelihoods, and that's all we can do here, because all options are still open. This could still go in a number of different ways. There are no certainties in this situation. But the likelihood is that Liverpool are probably, if they do buy him this summer, or were to buy him, let's say, in January, would be getting a discount to the upper end of the value range that people might ascribe to Isak. So if that value range is, let's say, 140 to 150 million pounds, which is much talked about and feels certainly in the realm of being the right number for probably the top striker in the Premier League, give or take Haaland, it is likely that the end amount that Liverpool would have to pay in the next couple of windows is probably going to be at a discount to that. And therefore, because they have that leverage in the negotiation, because the player only wants to go to Liverpool, it seems, it's arguable that Liverpool hold the cards in the situation as well. So it just depends which angle you're coming at it from. And of course, it also depends where, with the benefit of hindsight, the whole situation ends up. I mean, clearly, if the player ends up not going to Liverpool and it transpires that Liverpool did need a striker for the season, well, then, of course, we look at it and go, Liverpool didn't hold the cards and things look different. But you know, in terms of assessing it as we are today, I think there's a good argument for all of the parties being in a comfortable position. But you know, likewise, there are certain scenarios that can go wrong for all of these teams. Newcastle could well have a situation, for example, where they have a disgruntled player for an entire season. They're forced to pay for that player for the entire season. They get no output from that player, and they take a discount when they sell him next summer. That is also feasible. And they wouldn't be the first team. You know, we know that, for example, when Tevez went off golfing for 6 months in 2012, Manchester City ended up, the player did come back right at the end of the season, actually played a part in the title win, but we know that City lost tens of millions of pounds really on the back of that strike ultimately when the player eventually left the club, and damage was done. And none of these clubs are able, even in the Tevez situation, to reclaim more than 4 weeks' wages from the individual player because of the disciplinary code that they have with the PFA. So in that case, and Manchester City did appeal to the PFA to be able to fine Tevez more than 4 weeks, and that was rejected by the PFA. We don't even know what Newcastle have done in respect of that situation, but it's likely, again, the PFA would not play ball and would not accept a fine in excess of 4 weeks. So there is damage to potential to Newcastle as well, and the reality is we have to probably assess who benefited most from this situation, probably in the aftermath of a transfer.